All right, do you want
All
me just to
right.
jump in? Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, Bryan, and I really want to thank you for joining us today. Bryan joining us from WBGH in Boston this morning. As you may know from our website and from the emails, he has extensive background in addressing issues related to blindness and conducting research in that area. And I believe, Bryan, you've been director of the Accessible Learning and Assessment Technologies group with Media Access Group at WGBH for about 20 years now. Is that correct?
Well, I have been an employee of WGBH for about 20 years and working on accessibility issues for nearly all of those. So, yeah, I've been here a while.
That's great. And you are providing us with the presentation that's the second part of a accessible images presentation that Sue-Ann Ma from the Diagram Center started in November of last year. So Bryan, thank you so much for joining us. And you would like to take questions as they come up, is that correct?
Yes, and because of the mode I'm in now where I'm just sharing my screen, I can't see any of the controls, the speaker controls. So if the question comes up and you deem it important, just go ahead and tell me and read off the question and I'll answer it.
I will do that, Bryan. That's great. Thank you again.
All right. Well, hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us to talk about describing complex images for accessibility. There are a lot of slides. I think you're going to have the slides and the press to look out afterwards if we don't get through everything. So I'll move through them pretty quickly. I'm going to do a little introduction, and we're going to go right into guidelines for describing complex images, and then the real meat of the presentation is moving through some examples and taking what look like quite big, impressive, scary projects in describing some very complicated images and really breaking it down and giving you some hooks into how to tackle some of these complex images. And then the PowerPoint also has tools and resources, and then some other alternate methods of providing access to complex images we'll just move through very quickly at the end. So I'm representing sort of two groups. The primary group is the Diagram Center, which is a Department of Ed funded center. It's a partnership between Benetech and the National Center for Accessible Media at WGBH and the U.S. Fund for DAISY. And the mission of the Diagram Center, very simply, is to make it easier, cheaper, and faster to create and use accessible digital images. And there are, Sue-Ann can correct me, I think there's about 4 million projects currently underway for the Diagram Center. That might be a slight exaggeration, but only slight. And I'm very glad to say that we're wrapping up a 5-year grant. We've just gotten a new award, so the Diagram Center will continue to do this important work for another 5 years, which is really, really exciting. I am sitting right now at WGBH, which is the local public television station in Boston, Massachusetts, and one of the largest or the largest producer of adult primetime programming for public television. And we produce such shows as Frontline and This Old House and Nova and Masterpiece Theater and Mystery and American Experience and Antiques Roadshow and a whole lot of others. And so now the question you're formulating is, why is this guy at a local public television station talking to me about describing complex educational images for people who are blind or have low vision? And the reason is that WGBH has a long and storied history in creating accessible media and really a mission to make all of their programming and their content accessible to as many people as possible. And today's trivia that you will learn is that captioning and closed captioning, the technology to deliver captions to television, was actually developed here in Boston at WGBH, at the public television station in 1972. And the first program that was captioned on the air was Julia Child's The French Chef. And 20 years later, we developed sort of a parallel service called Descriptive Video Service, which is for people who are blind or have low vision. And this is called Descriptive Video Service, and it is an added track of audio narration added to a television show or a film that describes the key visual elements of a program, such as the costumes or the action or the scenery, so that nothing is lost, and that is inserted, that audio is inserted in between lines of dialogue so it doesn't disturb the flow of the program. And those are two important services that we've provided for many decades and continue to provide. Here's a slide of a cassette that actually lives in my office all the time, and if you can't see the title, it's an audio cassette with the title Fundraising on the Internet. And at one point, this was actually a viable piece of technology, an audio cassette talking to you about fundraising on the Internet. And all this is to illustrate that technology moves very rapidly, and we never know where it's going to land. And that's why WGBH, close to 20 years ago, created NCAM, which is the organization that I work at and represent today, which is the National Center for Accessible Media. And our mission really, very simply, is to help ensure that with every technological shift, people with sensory disabilities aren't left behind. And we do this through research and development and creating custom solutions and consulting with organizations and companies in how to make their websites, their hardware technology, whatever their media or digital offerings are, wherever they're found, ensure that they are accessible for people with sensory disabilities. And when we're talking about accessing websites especially, and you're talking about using a mouse or using a keyboard, with mobility impairments as well. So that is what we do here at NCAM. Today we're going to talk very specifically about images and making digital images accessible. And of course we know that images are found everywhere. I don't know if you can see this little note. Okay, sorry. I'm just trying to move that. Images are found everywhere, and here's an example of a website that has two images in it. Now, if you're trying to make this web page accessible for someone who's using a screen reader, most of the work is done through code. And both the text and the navigation of the website, using headings or using other code to move around the site, is all done through code, and ensuring that the links work and that the form fields are properly labeled so someone knows if they need to fill out a form, how they do it. That's all done through code. What a screen reader cannot do is interpret visual information. There is no screen reader that can arrive at the images that you see on this web page and describe them. So that has to be done in person, and it has to be done in text, because a screen reader will just come across an image and announce image and then move on and provide no information. So a person has to write a text alternative, commonly called an alt text or alt tag. They all mean the same thing. And these are two descriptions that were written for these images in particular. And when you look at the underlying code, this is what they look like. They're lines that are written inside of the HTML. It says alt equals, and then it's actually text that someone has written and put in there. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about alt text, alt tagging. Now those images were very straightforward. Often when we're talking about education and higher ed, we're looking at images that are far more complicated, and that is what we're going to be diving into today. Thankfully, the National Center for Accessible Media has been working on solutions for creating alt text for these types of images for well over a decade through a multitude of federally funded research and development projects, both for the National Science Foundation and the Department of Ed. And these projects have been in some of the way we've done this research is working really with some wonderful STEM professionals, science, technology, engineering, and math professionals who are blind or have low vision, and working with them to uncover the techniques and the ways that they moved through their education, including postgraduate, into their graduate work and into their professional careers, because still they are working with images and visual information every day. And how is it that they are receiving that information and interpreting it, and then how can we take their success stories and then boil those down into guidelines and then really scale that up so that those successful techniques for accessing images can be used by anybody who needs them. And what these projects became were, in fact, a series of guidelines. And here's two examples. And you'll see how these two images, one's sort of they're both sort of charts. One's a clear bar chart, another's sort of a timeline chart, and how these have been reinterpreted, one as a nested list and the other as a table. And the guidelines boil down really to four basic principles, and we're going to go over these in detail as the hour moves on. But they're this: brevity, clarity and consistency, organization, and navigation. And when I talk about those two things, I'm talking about organization of the information and how it's presented, and then navigation, and that really gets into the use of things like HTML lists and tables. So with that brief introduction about how we got to this point, we'll dive right into the guidelines. For anyone who has spent any time writing image descriptions of any simplicity or complexity, there's a set of rules of the road or guidelines that really should be followed. And I'll just touch on those briefly. You should either be a subject matter expert or at least have access to one, because it's very hard to accurately describe an image if you have no idea what it means. This is common sense, but it is often practice just to hand off the image description work to a group who knows about accessibility but may not know very much about biology or nursing or engineering or chemistry. And so you need to have either subject matter experts working on it or access to those subject matter experts. Screen readers will hiccup over spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes, just as anyone who's reading a poorly written text would be, and it's quite annoying. So make sure that your alt text and your image descriptions are well written. Make sure they're not any longer than they need to be, and that the vocabulary is appropriate for the context, because we don't want to increase the cognitive load, which is already can be quite immense with some of these, because the description is poorly worded or poorly written or poorly constructed. And we'll talk about how to do it properly in just a moment. Do a review of your work, and then the best way to find out if your description or your alt text, especially for complex images, is efficient and effective and useful and accurate is to have someone read the description who has never seen the image, and then discover if you've done the job correctly. At least when you're starting out, if you've never done this type of work before, that is really an essential check to see that you haven't left anything out of your image description. Now I'm going to boil this down in three simple questions. Whenever you're sitting down to write a description, there's really three questions to ask yourself in order to ensure that you're thinking of everything in context. Okay, so why is the image there? These images almost never exist just on their own. They're usually housed in and among other text. If it's in a textbook or an assessment, there's a certain context that that image is being presented in. So why is that particular image there? Is it just decoration? Is it important? Is it repetition of what the text is already explaining? Why did someone make the decision to put the image there? Who's the intended audience? You could imagine an image of, I don't know, a building or a bridge. The same image of a suspension bridge is going to be described quite differently for, say, a photography book as it would be for an engineering book, because the purpose of the image is different, the intended audience is different. So know the context. And finally, if there's no description, what will the viewer miss? And that's really the key question. Maybe there isn't any description needed. If there is, what is the viewer or the reader going to miss? What's the essential information they're not going to get if there's no alt text? And that's where you begin to say, okay, now I know the key elements, I know the most important information, that has to go in there. And you would be surprised how often the most obvious information is often skipped over in an effort to be otherwise very, very thorough. So with that, we'll move right into the most complex images. Okay, again, we're focusing on brevity, being as short and concise as possible without leaving out information. A focus on data, and by that, it also means not providing information, especially about visual elements that aren't important. And we'll look at some examples. Be clear and concise, and be clear and consistent in your language. I'll talk about how to implement drill down organization, meaning a general summary, and then leading to more and more specific information so that someone has an idea of what this image is before they're sort of presented with all of the details without even having a grasp on, well, what is this thing that I'm reading about? I don't even know what this image is. So it's important to set the stage, if you will. And then, of course, the use of HTML tables and lists, which you can do using long desk and other means. Okay. So now I'm going to walk through some examples about how we approach complex image description. So the first is a line graph, and it just has two lines doing very different things. But there's almost always going to be some information that's available to you as the description writer for any complex image. One is a title that's going to give the reader a lot of information, and it's going to begin to set the stage. So what is the title of this thing? In this case, it's Foreign Trade of Country X. What's the construction of the image? Is it a bar graph? Is it a pie chart? Is it a map? Is it a clock? In this case, it's a line graph or a line chart. And then a summary of an overview, and this is where maybe the art and science, if you will, or the technical writing and creative writing aspect of writing image descriptions really comes into play, because you can have a pretty exhaustive overview, or you can have a very, very brief overview. In this case, you can say imports basically steadily increase while exports, waver from year to year. That would be very simplistic, or you can sort of hit some of the high notes and the low notes of each of the lines in your summary, and it's really your judgment call about what is appropriate for that. And then the specific data comes in. So let's look at what that description looks like. If you follow this method, you just present the title as it is, a line graph entitled Foreign Trade of Country X and the years. What's the construction? There's two lines on the graph, a dashed line labeled exports, a solid line labeled imports, and then some of the XY axis information, which is right there. So now we have set the stage. The reader knows the title of it, knows it's a graph, knows how it's constructed, knows what years we're dealing with, and then the summary. And in this case, the summary is two sentences, one describing in a little bit of detail the exports line, and another the imports line. And for this particular one in the context, this may be all the information someone needs, and they can drop out and say, okay, now let me go back to the text, or let me look for the next image. I have a summary of what it is, that's all I need. However, you may be in an assessment where someone's answering questions about this, and that could include an end of the chapter quiz or something like that. Or it doesn't appear that the graph is all that important, but then it's referenced later, and the reader needs to know some specific information. And so in those cases, the specific data can be presented in an accessible table, and those are quite navigable and readable by someone who can read those with a screen reader. So with that introduction, with the double line graph, we'll move into some common types of complex images. So we tried to sort of group up the most common sorts of images that you find, and at first glance, they don't look perhaps like it's going to be a table or a list, but we'll look at them and you'll see how they begin to break down. So here we have sort of an infographic with little drawings of men and women. There's a lot of color going on. Every column is a different color. The headings are all different colors. There's a lot of information going on. A lot of it is just extra. It's just visual. It doesn't add to presenting the information at all. What you really have, if you strip away all of the color and you get rid of the little pictures of the people, you see, oh, all I have is a table here. It's straightforward. There is a title, there's some column headings, and then we have the information. And that's exactly how you can present it. Table titled Expanding Education, Decreasing Illiteracy, and then you simply have yours and your specific data. So I'll just switch back and forth, and you can see visually how you've made sort of a colorful, very visually intense graphic into a very straightforward table. And I might hazard to guess that there are some learners who don't have any visual impairments at all who might benefit from reading information in sort of a straightforward black and white, if you will, way, as opposed to sort of a colorful, visually rich image such as this. And of course, there are learners that prefer this style as well. So then here we have a bar graph. And so this can go, again, straight into a table, just like the other one. And when we built the table for this one, we found sometimes the table isn't even necessary. Sometimes it can just become a list, which is even easier to navigate. And I'll show you how we broke down this one into a list. So we have a title, of course, the bar, or a description. This one didn't have a title. A bar chart shows funding in billions of dollars per year. So in this case, we sort of had to set the stage with the description. There wasn't a title. And then where you would have 3 columns in a table, in this case, it reads just as clearly in a list that someone can move down very easily. So you have the Marshall Plan, or you have the particular funding source, and then the year, and then the amount. And it's still a small enough amount of information, so even if you were required to do comparisons, perhaps for the amounts, you could do that in this list fairly easily. Now we start to move into some pretty complicated visuals. This is sort of a flow chart, and it's about how to effectively search for through Wikipedia. And there's ovals and squares and circles and different colors and lots of arrows, and it's can be very daunting if you've never worked on anything like this. We found for flowcharts, it can be quite effective to break them down into nested lists. So in this case, once you start to break down the image, it's actually very, very straightforward, because there's really only 2 lines. Search Wikipedia, and then is it found, or is there a related term? And then if it's found, yes, it ends, and then you go back to the beginning, or it's a very straight linear line to back at the beginning. And on the other one, you continue to have branches off. So in this case, the nested list is a perfectly fine structure for presenting this type of information. And now I'm going to show you an example of another sort of flow chart. Again, very, very, there's a lot of visuals going on. There's a picture of a man's torso, and then we have different foods and lots of words sort of everywhere in different color arrows. And when you convert this information into a nested list, it becomes really complex, because we have sort of 4 headings, we have subcategories, and then sub-subcategories, and the navigation of this by a screen reader can get unwieldy, if you will. So what we did was we took this, we said, wow, this is really a lot of nesting in the list, and it's hard to know exactly what level you're at any time. Then, sort of counterintuitively from everything I've been talking about, we said, what if we turn that back into sentences? So we took the graphic, we used all the specific information, turned it back into sentences, and we found we were able to do it all in 4 pretty succinct sentences that are all pretty straightforward. So sometimes, you go through what you think is the right path to provide the information in the most efficient way possible and find, well, I've actually made it more complicated. So let's back up and see if simply explaining it in words is good. In this case, it was. Okay. So as many times as you've been through this, again, sort of art and science, sort of technical writing versus creative writing, you can find that there's often a choice that needs to be made to say, this image looks like a lot of other images I've worked on, but when I make the description, when I've written the description, it's not as efficient as I think it could be. Let me try this other method. And really, because what you want to do is make it best for the person who's relying on the alt text for the information in the image. They don't have the image necessarily to know, okay, am I getting everything? Let's move into some really, really, really data-rich images. I like to use maps because they're totally intimidating, even for written many, many descriptions. But there are ways to break these down and present them, the information with image. Okay, there are, and I'll talk about alternatives to tactile images, raised line diagrams. There are other ways to present especially maps and other types of graphics like this. But let's talk specifically about image description because there are benefits to providing the information in words, and here we're going to talk about specifically in tables. So with a map of the entire United States, it's titled Dam Removals by State 2001 to 2010. And sometimes you have to just look at a graphic and say, in the highest level, in quite literally the 50,000 feet up view, what am I seeing? I'm seeing a map of the United States, and it seems like in the Great Lakes and sort of the East Coast, there's a lot of something going on. I don't even you need to know what it is. There's just the lines are, or the bars are bigger over there. There's few, if any, lines in the middle of the country, and on the West Coast, there are 3 little lines, but they're bigger than through the large span in the middle of the country. So whatever's happening is happening more in these 2 places, and it breaks down that way. That's really a good way to start in saying, okay, now I've at least broken it down to saying, to give a general observation, and sometimes that's all that's needed. Of course, so we have a title, Dam Removal by State, 2001 to 2010. Construction of the image, I've just given you that. It's a map with bar graphs showing dam removals by state. A summary is sort of this, there's a lot going on in this area, there's some going on in this area, there's very little going on in this area. And then if necessary, you can give even more information, which would be either a state by state or a moving through the country, or greatest to least sort of activity. In this particular one, that wasn't necessary. This was a scholarly article. The graphic was really just to sort of visually show what I just told you, that general sentiment about where, in the briefest terms, activity was happening, but not to really break it down and say, well, in Pennsylvania, 750 dams have been removed, whereas in Wisconsin it was 35 or whatever. It wasn't that level of information. So, you can stop at the summary or overview level. Okay. The same isn't true for this very complex map. The title is The Election of 1912, and we have so much information going on here. But even as we begin our looking at the construction of the graphic phase, we say, okay, well, what do we really have here? We have a table at the top, the electoral and popular votes, and then we have a map underneath which shows which candidate carried which states. Now, we're talking about all 50 states here, or No, we're not talking about 50 states. We're talking about 48 states here. And that's a lot of information. Now, it's there. It's in the book. In context, it turns out that, yes, someone actually does need to know most of this information, because I believe there were questions about some of the states and which they carried. So how do you provide all of that information? And when necessary, descriptions can be very, very lengthy. If there's a lot of information and it's all important and it's not provided elsewhere, either in the text or in the photo caption or somewhere else, then it is the job of the alt text or the image description to provide all of that information. So let's look at two different ways of doing that. So here we have a title, the map of electoral votes. Now, there's sort of a general summary method you could use, breaking it down. Democratic won all states except those listed below. And then California was a special exception because it split its electoral votes. The Progressives won only a few states, so it's easy to list those. The Republicans won 2, the Socialists won none. So here we're sort of saying Democrats won all except for the ones we're mentioning specifically down there. So the choice is not to name all of the yellow states, it's to name the others and say, by the process of elimination, now you know which states went to the Democrats. You could, rather than just doing it that way, you could also provide it as an additional column on the table. So as you convert the table that's at the top of the graphic here, party, candidate, electoral votes, popular votes, you could add another column. It's one and just say, the information from the map is provided in the states won. Now, if you needed to know the actual state-by-state breakdown, for example, Texas has 20 electoral votes, then you're talking about a much larger description. You're probably talking about a list that lists every single state and its electoral votes and who it went to. So again, context is key in knowing, is that level of breakdown necessary or not? In this case, it wasn't. So the states were important to know who they went to, but the electoral breakdown, the numbers, were not important. So we didn't do that in this case. The totals were important, but they're provided in already. Okay, so we have two different maps, two different approaches, and now we get to a really complicated one. And I'm not going to say that this image can be perfectly described in words and that the entire experience of viewing this map and looking at the different railroads, this map is about railroad lines and time broken out into time zones and really looking at two different time periods, railroads before 1870 and then 20 years later by 1890, and which expanded and what cities they were in. There's just a lot of information here, but the important information can be provided, and again, we break it down into parts. We can start with a summary of the time zone. That's very important here. The country is broken down to 4 time zones, and you can roughly say where those borders are. And then you can summarize in relation to those time zones and by naming the key cities where the specific rail lines are. And in fact, most of the rail lines only go between major cities or cities within a time zone, except for the transcontinental line, which exists. So you really do have to spend a lot of time with a graphic like this to understand what it's saying and how to most effectively and efficiently provide the information that's needed. And then from there, of course, the second piece of information, it was prior to 1870 and then in the 20 years after 1890. So you're talking about a lot of information, okay? And I didn't show you the description here because it's just overwhelming. It's an enormous amount. But none of this information was provided in the text. The student was, the graphic was required because the student didn't get any other information in the text. So it was all here laid out in the map. And so it was the job of the alt text and ultimately the person who's writing it to provide that information that was put there in the graphic. Okay, so that's a lot of visual information. Our next example that we see so often, you can call this an infographic, and these can be really, they can really sort of test your patience as you decide how to describe something like this. But really, it is quite straightforward. If you break it down into parts, again, there's a title, and there's some sort of introductory information up at the top. And then there's the middle section and the bottom section. In fact, there's a footer. There's almost a fourth part of this infographic. Each section is giving you slightly different information, and they're also presented differently. The top part, you could really express almost as straight ahead sentences, even though they're broken out and they look different visually. You can just read through this in a logical manner, and it sounds just fine. And so and we kept the just to show you where we got the information, we kept the capital letters here for the presentation. If you were writing alt text, you wouldn't keep all caps like that. You would just write in standard mixed case. And then we have the middle section. The middle section is really, again, just two distinct pieces of information, but they're presented in these little circles. And so there needs to be a little bit of context. You're talking about the liver, and then boom, boom, here's the two little pieces of information that are provided there, and then a third piece in this sort of banner. And then the final one is two columns. And again, the columns can be read in a straightforward manner. Even though they look separated, there's lots of graphics in there. The graphics are just extra. It's just eye candy. It's decoration. It's not adding any more information. The text is doing all of the work, so that actually makes it easier for the person who's writing the alt text. Okay. So now I'm going to go just into a couple of more examples of different types of description or using information from various places to enhance your description, or to again give you an anchor for where to begin your description. So here's a circuit, very simple one, and I'll just walk through the first part of the description. You'll see it's very detailed. So the title is a schematic diagram of a simple circuit with a switch. 3 batteries form a power pack. Each battery is represented by a pair of long, and in parentheses, positive and short negative lines. Now that's a lot of information, and it is in some ways, I wouldn't say interpretive, but it's sort of added into the description where, of course, it's visual. The battery does have long and short lines, but the describer, or the person writing the alt text, has decided to add, in addition, for example, in the second bullet, they say the open switch is represented as a break in the wire lifted as a diagonal. So really moving step by step through element and describing in a lot of detail the visual elements of how this circuit is put together. So this would have been done for an image that's found very early on in instruction, clearly, and probably the first time a student is seeing a circuit depicted in an illustration like this. Once a student has the familiarity with how circuits are depicted visually, then the description can also get much more succinct, and you would just say that there's a battery and an open switch and a light, and the visual representations wouldn't have to be described in this level of detail every time. This can also be very helpful. Remember, your audience for image descriptions are not just people who are completely blind, who cannot see the images at all, often people who have low vision will both listen to the text, read the text, look at an image, often magnified to a large degree, and also listen to the description or the alt text if it's there, to put all of that information together to be able to get it. So the audience, if you will, for image description, it can be quite broad. So just keep that in mind.
Bryan, I might just interrupt
Yes.
here. There's a comment from Charles in the chat, and he's saying the zigzag line would be a resistor and should have been surrounded by a circle. This is where domain knowledge is key.
That's true. And I will say I didn't write this description, but I don't know enough to correct it either. So I will go back to the comments and then I will fix this description. Thank you very much.
But I think the point is really great that you made earlier too, that subject matter experts really need to be involved in writing those alternative text descriptions.
Oh, absolutely. They really do. In fact, we did a very large project where we did an item bank of 10,000 images for an online assessment provider called NWEA, Northwest Evaluation Associates. And we really had to have daily contact with their subject matter experts because although we knew a lot about describing images and we had subject matter knowledge, especially when you're dealing with assessments, you need to know not only what the image is representing, but what is being tested. And so that's just another level of sort of complexity that gets woven in. So thank you for correcting me. I will say I once traveled, I did sort of a roadshow on image description and was using a complicated chart that had a lot of different birds on it. And you know, again, like this, it was really for illustration purposes to say the way you would approach image description like this. And afterwards, an ornithologist came up and very nicely took me to task for describing the birds with inaccurate terms. So I fixed it all, and now I feel like I'm doing a little bit more service, which is great. Okay, so here's Entering the Third Dimension, which is a cute title because they're three-dimensional images. But what I want to show is that actually you can say there's another dimension to your image description, which is really look at it in context. And by that I mean, what's the language that's used in the captions or in the figure descriptions that are already there in the text? Because when you look at these images and think about describing them, all sorts of terms can pop up, but what's already there for you to use? And here we have some arrows pointing out some really great evocative language. So on the left we have, it's a ribbon model. You can work with that. You can describe it as, like a ribbon. You have folds and coils, great action language. It's already describing a yellow line in there that's labeled the groove, okay? On the other side, it's a globular shape, okay? So amazing language, all of which can then be utilized in your description without having to come up with, even another set of descriptive terms. Because clearly the physicality of those objects is part of why they're being represented there as three-dimensional objects. So I just love these, so I'll read. The ribbon model resembles a tangle of string connected in a few places with yellow lines. One section is indented and labeled groove. So that way you can integrate the language that's already there for the student into the image description so they feel of a piece. Okay. And so I'm just going to throw this one up there and say, after hearing me talk for 45 minutes, everybody should be able to describe this pretty succinctly in just a couple of minutes. So go ahead. Okay, I'm joking. It's a really complex image. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of text in here as well, which makes it quite complex. And unfortunately, this was sort of a standalone image in the book that it came in, and so the description had to do all of the work of explaining what was going on in this complex image. But the approach is the same. You know, is there a title? What is the construction of it? Is there a summary? And then when you get down, and these are going to be long descriptions, what's the data? And pay attention to the arrows. Often we say don't pay attention to irrelevant visual details. Often color or the size of things really aren't important. They're just put in for visual interest. In this case, that's not true. The blue means one thing. It means that things are moving in one direction over the interstitial fluid. Red means it's moving in the other direction. And also the size of the arrows actually do have meaning. So are they very narrow, medium-sized arrows, large arrows? And it's okay to use sort of very direct terminology like that, small, medium, and large, because there's so much information. You don't want to have to make it more complex than it already is. And here's just a quick example. But I want to move away from those types of images in the little bit of time we have left, just to look at some other image types that on the face of them don't look complex, but they often really create challenges for people. Okay, and those would be illustrations and cartoons. And by illustrations, I mean something like this. These are heat images, and I know, and it says, I think it's before playing handball and after playing handball. And I often use an image like this for people who are just coming on to writing image description, and you get stumped because there's a lot of variation or color gradation in both images of the person before and after. Is it green? Is it blue? Where's the yellow? Where's the red? Where's the orange? And you get back 3 or 4 paragraphs describing these heat images, where in fact, in context, all that's important is the top image is mostly blue and green, and the bottom is mostly orange and red. So sometimes a great deal of detail is needed. Often just a very quick summary can be sufficient to provide the information that, again, why is the image there? What's the work of the image doing? That should guide you in how you describe things. Illustrations, again, know what they are in context. Here we have a Civil War engraving, and you might think you could just get away with, a battle scene or 2 sides of the army fight, and there's a lot of smoke in the field. But in fact, that's not the point of this image. If you read the caption here, it says, "This engraving of the battle reveals the strategic role that land features can play in determining the outcome of the battle." So now you have your stage or your setting. You say, okay, now I know what I'm actually having described is how land features are depicted and what's going on in this image. And again, maybe the text in the page surrounding it will give you further guidance. Cartoons are a really special challenge. I just picked a political cartoon here. They're often really visually rich with a lot of information. And again, you could go on for paragraphs on an image like this. But to really do it justice and not have somebody spend 5 minutes reading a cartoon, unless it's in the context of breaking down cartoons pixel by pixel. What is the setting? Who are the characters? Only the details that are needed. For example, we know that the character on the left is Uncle Sam. We don't have to describe his starred jacket and striped pants, even though they're great touches. You're sort of getting further away from the point of the cartoon, because the cartoon is supposed to set a stage and then give you a punchline, which is, well, I hardly know which to take first. Okay, well, you have to describe what it is he's looking at, which is the menu, which is various countries for at this point for the U.S. To take over. So work with the caption, sort of work back to say what's the information that has to be provided in the shortest amount of text I can give to make this cartoon make sense. Just a brief minute. I've talked about assessment a little bit, and I'll just say that teaching concepts with images is very different than using images when testing a student's content knowledge. Of course, we all know this. I'm going to give you a really basic example. So if you saw an image like this and you were writing an alt text, you might just say, this is a tick, straightforward, does the job. However, in an assessment situation, in this particular one, there's a question. What's the name of this animal? Oh, great, says the description writer. I can't call it a tick because that will give away the answer. That's choice B. So now what? Okay, move to your subject matter expertise. What do I know about ticks? How are they different than beetles? What's a bug anyway? And then you can come up with an alt text that provides a description of the image without and giving essential information that's no different than what you can see visually, which is important. And then saying, okay, is this sufficient to carry the day here so that someone can read that? Is that information they're supposed to know at this grade level in this course that they're taking, that they're being tested on? Now, is this a viable item? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes an item can be deemed visually biased and must be removed from the assessment, and a different item with a different image has to take its place. There are content considerations. It's best for test takers to be familiar with the style of image description techniques in the classroom before they ever come to an assessment. You don't want to have anything new you've never seen or heard before or moved through before in terms of navigation on test day. That's always bad. And can a student use their assistive technology that they use every day to on test day with the assessment? So, and I'm skipping all the other bullet points, but those are two really important factors when considering assessment. You want a student to be as comfortable as possible in using the tools that are familiar to them from everyday instruction when you're in an assessment environment. We only have a couple of minutes left. There's quite a few links and resources, both from NCAM and from Diagram. And then I will just say that the techniques that we use for writing description can also, if necessary, be read aloud as narration or read live by a proctor if necessary. Again, title, construction, summary, data. That approach works very well to create a script if you need to have it read aloud. Tactile diagrams can be very, very helpful. There's information at the Diagram Center about tactile diagrams, raised line diagrams. Enhanced tactile is using audio and tactile graphics together. There's many products and examples of that out on the market. Digital tactile is using the vibrating motors inside of a tablet or a smartphone to replicate a raised line diagram. That technology is moving. We're seeing some examples of this. Manipulatives, good old wiki sticks and hard rubber models can often be the best ways to teach highly visual concepts for people who have low vision or who are blind. So these are still in use every day in classrooms. 3D printers are making things like manipulatives and other 3D models sort of cheaper and easier to create and almost on the fly. So we're glad to see that technology moving along. And then if you want to move it sort of into the future, you can think about haptics and digital 3D images that aren't actually there, holograms, and using haptic technology to make that a sensory tactile experience as well. So we've come to the end. Here's my contact information. I'll stay on the line for another 5 minutes or so for questions. But I hope that was a helpful introduction to describing complex images.
Bryan, thanks so much. That was really interesting. And I see Janet Sedgley with IT here says, thank you, that was very helpful. Sue Ann is saying, been wanting to catch your presentation for a while now. This is great. Thanks so much, Bryan. Yeah, that was really great. You know what I especially appreciated? Brenda Miller says, thank you so much. I really learned a lot. Um, I really, sometimes when we're working with faculty and talking about complex images, and they'll talk about using images in assessment, and they'll say, well, my whole class period is a PowerPoint. Charles said, great job, Bryan, and Kathy said, thank you, and so did the Innovation Studio. But their whole class period will be a series of, say, historical um, drawings or, historical maps.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole class period is discussing and interpreting those images.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of the guidelines you gave will be really helpful for us to share with faculty on how they might manage that. What would you say to faculty who have, PowerPoints that are just a series of complex images and it's meant to be a class discussion?
Well, that's a tricky one, of course, if the references are all highly visual. But again, in my presentation here, I described most images. I tried to do a good job of that as they appear. So again, setting up what is it that we have before us. Here's the important elements of it. Yes, we're going to talk about interpretations of it or what's important, but at least guide the conversation so that if someone is having trouble seeing it or can't see it at all, knows what we're dealing with. And you could think about this. What if someone was it's not always is there someone who has a visual impairment that's preventing them from seeing it, but what if you have a very crowded classroom or a very large lecture hall and it's a small hard to see because of proximity or because something else is preventing someone from seeing it well. So you can use the same techniques, and you can either prepare them ahead of time or do it on the fly if you've had some experience in doing it. It's really, it's as much about inclusion as anything else.
Yeah. John G. said, thanks. This was very interesting and helped to clarify description quite a bit. Aaron Page says, do you recommend putting this same information in the title and description fields or unique text in both? So in our learning management system, it'll call for alternative text. And in Word, it will do that too. And sometimes it has, it provides both title and description fields.
Mm-hmm.
So
in that case, every situation and sort of interface is different, but for the most part, I wouldn't repeat information. So if the title is in a title field and a screen reader user can find that easily and then move into the description, then I wouldn't repeat the title. Just and the next thing that they would discover would be a repeat of what they just heard. So if there's a natural place to find the title, that's where it should be and not repeated in the description text.
Okay, and Charles again said we need to be concerned on character limits in alt text and its restriction on adding HTML elements such as lists and tables inside alt text, which is where an alternative such as long desk or ARIA described by could be a solution when these lists and table descriptions are needed. And he says, sorry, have to run into another meeting I'm chairing, but glad to talk more about this later.
Well, and he's correct, and you're correct that alt text does have a character limit. Excuse me, and does not accept HTML formatting, or HTML at all. So it's purely text in the alt tag. So you have to use long desk or described by to provide that. But there's no other way to really provide all the information that those complex images contain.
And sometimes, and you touched on this, sometimes it's more inclusive and helpful for everyone to have a paragraph under the image that so that everyone can read the description that's being provided.
Absolutely, yeah.
Tracy says, will we have access to these PowerPoint slides for review later? And Tracy, yes, we created a page for Bryan on the website for this interest group, and we'll put the recording there, and his slideshow will be there as well. So we're 4 minutes after the hour. Bryan, Tracy says, great, thank you. Really appreciate your time today. This has just been really helpful. A lot of the information you shared, I know we'll be incorporating into workshops here on our campus, because this is really a tough area for faculty to deal with when it comes to making either their online courses or their PowerPoints or their Word documents accessible. And Erin Page says, this was great. Thank you so much. So thank you, Bryan. Really great talking with you, and look forward to staying in touch with your work.
Oh, absolutely. You're welcome. And it was really great and to join your group and to be able to share the word here. Thank you so much.
Great. All right. Well, Cheryl Stanley from Great Falls says thank you as well. We'll conclude this session, and do stay in touch. We'll have our monthly webinar in March again, and with another guest speaker. So thank you, everyone. Bryan, a special thanks to you, and have a good Friday, everyone.
All right. Take care.
So I stopped the recording, Bryan, and
All right.
that was really, really great.
Oh, good.
You had
I didn't hear a lot of questions, but I did a lot of talking. So
yeah. I think they were very fascinated. You had about 17 people, which was quite large, and a number of the names I didn't recognize. So I think you had some people from that other group with the Big Ten universities in.
Oh, great.
So we'll get your recording up, and I have your PowerPoint. You got all the way through that. That was fantastic.
I couldn't believe it.
You and Sue-Ann both. Sue-Ann had a really large PowerPoint presentation, and she also made it. So thank you again. That was just fantastic. I really picked up some good pointers for how I can work with faculty here.
All right, wonderful.
All right.
Well, I was just going to say, have a good rest of the day and have a good weekend.
You as well. Enjoy that snowstorm.
All right, take care.
You too.